How does political lobbying affect laws and policies on climate change in the United States? By Rafael Barada. The United States is the most scientifically advanced nation on the planet, yet when it comes to policies on climate change, we are clearly lagging behind. Why is it that the country that has provided the world with so many of the technological advancements that have defined our 21st century life has still yet to recognize the fact that human activity is a contributing factor towards climate change? Even though the scientific consensus is overwhelming, with 97% of climate scientists concluding that climate change is perpetuated by humans, why do our politicians still neglect the fact that climate change is induced by human activities? The answer is quite simple: special interests or lobbying. The reason that there is such a huge discrepancy in the scientific consensus on climate change and the little action or lack thereof taken by our politicians is because of the fact that they are beholden to specific interest groups. In this video, I will explain why and how political lobbying groups influence our politicians, which are the main interest groups actively manipulating our politicians, and lastly, how political lobbying has affected climate change laws in the US. However, before we dive deep into the research, I want to ensure that every viewer is aware of the basics of lobbying in the first place. What is lobbying? According to the definition provided by Encyclopedia Britannica, lobbying is any attempt by individuals or private interest groups to influence the decisions of government. With that being said, lobbying is a crucial element towards a liberal democracy, since it ensures that all groups, even minorities, are able to have their voices heard. Interest groups. According to Oxford dictionaries, an interest group is a group of people that seek to influence public policy on the basis of a particular common interest or concern. All interest groups share a desire to affect government policy to benefit themselves. Examples of interest groups would be those that advocate for gun rights, environmental conservatives, retired Americans, and civil rights groups. Each of these groups' main priority is to advance their stance or position. For instance, a civil rights group's main purpose is to expand the civil liberties to either a certain group of people or everyone. An example of this would be the NAACP. These interest groups then try to either manipulate or influence politicians in order to block legislation that would hurt them or pass legislation that would benefit their cause. PACs. According to Open Secrets, PAC, or a Political Action Committee, is a political committee organized for the purpose of raising and spending money to elect and defeat candidates. Now that we have covered the basics on lobbying and interest groups, it's time to mention how interest groups are even able to influence politicians in the first place. Interest groups influence politicians all over the country in multiple ways. However, the most powerful method is by far through campaign donations. According to Tim Romer, former congressman of Indiana's 3rd Congressional District, politicians now spend at least half their time trying to rack up as many donations as possible rather than actually being politicians. To put this into perspective, in 2016, members of both the House of Representatives and the Senate earned a yearly salary of $174,000, yet the average cost of a campaign for a congressman in the House was $1.3 million, and in the Senate, it was $10.4 million. Seeing the disparity between the yearly salaries of politicians and the average cost of campaigns, it is inevitable for politicians to seek outside help. This is the perfect environment for interest groups to seep in. Politicians at this point have no other option but to turn to large organizations in order to provide funds for their election. They are now forced to sell out and abandon their beliefs and values in order to appease their donors. Who are the players? There are dozens of interest groups and corporations that are contributing to the attitude of climate change now in our government. These groups advocate for the usage of fossil fuels. As we all know, fossil fuels are energy sources like oil and coal. Unfortunately, they are not clean, which causes harm to our environment. The main goal for these institutions is to try to delay action on climate change or to pass legislation friendly towards the fossil fuel industry. The biggest players by far are the Koch brothers. David and Charles Koch control Koch Industries, the second largest company in the US. They are involved in refining and distribution of petroleum, chemicals, energies, and minerals. Since the 1980s, the Koch brothers have invested tens of billions of dollars to political organizations, interest groups, and campaigns. Some of the most notable contributions include donations to various conservative and libertarian groups, such as AEI, American Enterprise Institute, Cato Institute, Heritage Foundation, Manhattan Institute for Policy Research, and more. According to Union of Concerned Scientists, all of these interest groups actively lobby politicians and misinform the public on climate change. The Koch brothers even founded their own interest group in 2004 named AFP, Americans for Prosperity, Being one of the most influential conservative interest groups in America, AFP led opposition initiatives against global warming regulation under the Obama presidency. This chart shows the amount of money that the Koch brothers contributed in the 2016 elections. Dozens of other organizations in the oil and gas sector also contribute to lobbying groups. These include Chevron, ExxonMobil, and many more. According to Open Secrets, the top 20 contributors contributed more than $100 million in 2016. What has been the impact on U.S. policy? Since the arrival of President Trump to the White House, we have seen a dramatic overhaul in the way we even look at climate change. In March of 2017, Trump signed an executive order which would remove 6 Obama-era executive orders that were designed to curb carbon emissions, according to Dan Merrica of CNN. 3 months later, in June of 2017, Trump announced that the U.S. would be withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accords. This has made us the only country not to be a signatory of the agreement. Even though these accords were not binding, it was a step towards the right direction to get us on track to curb our carbon emissions, and more importantly, to finally admit that climate change is not only a real threat, but perpetuated by humans. In October of that same year, President Donald Trump announced the shrinking of 1 million acres of land in 2 national parks in the state of Utah in order to allow for oil drilling and coal mining to take place. These companies will not stop on their own. As stated by Ebinger and Sabitakis, the melting of the ice in the Arctic offers these companies even more oil to drill for that was previously unattainable. Conflicts will arise due to global warming. According to Homer Dixon, environmental changes can be the cause of acute conflicts. Syria is a prime example. According to P.H. Gleich, since the mid-2000s, a severe drought plagued the region. By 2011, this drought affected 2 to 3 million Syrians. 1.5 million rural workers were then displaced into large urban centers where they were placed in refugee camps. These were all contributing factors toward the civil war that is still being fought to this day. What can be done? After seeing how powerful the oil industry is and the lasting influence on our politicians, including our very own president, it may seem futile to try to defeat it. However, there are multiple ways to go about it. First, we need to become more politically literate as a society. Americans have a bad rap for not being too politically knowledgeable. Because of this, we allow ourselves to get swindled by big corporations and cunning politicians. We must be aware of what is going on in the world around us, and we must do our due diligence and research politicians before we go on to the polls. Not just what his or her stance is on a certain issue, but where they get their money from. We must also take cues from the fight against the tobacco industry in the 50s and the 60s. They used the same tactic that big oil is using today. That is, denying science that related tobacco to negative health consequences. As the science became clearer, legislation soon followed that hindered the tobacco industry, such as warning on boxes, advertising bans, and smoking bans. We had to find new solutions, but keep the same blueprint. Thank you. That is my video.